Hi, we're Auction Conservation, and this is the Shoot Room Sessions. Alexa, welcome to the Shoot Room.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Can you tell people who you are and what you do?
I certainly can. So I'm Alexa Culver. I'm General Counsel at Environment Bank. We are a company that is on a mission to restore as much biodiversity and nature as we can across England. We are already managing around 6,000 acres of land for biodiversity net gain. As a company, we've been around since 2006, and we've went from a traditional ecological consultancy through to investing in land, investing in projects with landowners and local communities, and delivering biodiversity net gain into the complex planning system that our developer clients are navigating. And as General Counsel, my responsibility is to look after our legal relationships with landowners, legal relationships with local planning authorities that are governing and overseeing the habitat banks that we're creating, and our legal relationships with developers and helping to support them through the planning system.
What an amazing opening. Okay, so let's talk about you first. Can you take people through your contents page? If you wrote the autobiography, I'm not assuming you haven't already, ready to come out. What are those key chapters? Where did you grow up? When did you first connect with the environment? Tell us your story.
Of course. So I grew up on a council estate in London where the most amount of nature I remember was a funny kind of weird field in the back of a block of flats that we called the Devil's Basin as children, just because it had a big divot in the middle of it. And that was about as much nature as I really knew growing up, and I think is obviously the case for a lot of children growing up in the city. I remember the first time that I went on a holiday to Hinton St George in Somerset, and I remember bundling into the back of a family friend's car and falling asleep in the back of the car as we were driving along the A303, and then waking up at night time and looking out the back and seeing the stars like I've never seen the stars before growing up in London. And in an odd way, I think that's the first major connection with nature that I remember. Although it's not quite nature as we'd normally describe it, it felt like nature to me. And I was determined as a child to become a lawyer. I don't know why. I remember looking up to a grown-up that had asked me, and I said, I'd either like to be a social anthropologist or a lawyer. And they're like, oh, okay. And I was just determined and worked very hard, enjoyed school, ultimately moved as a teenager to North Devon, so not very far away from here. And that's when really I knew I loved the countryside, because I lived and breathed the countryside, cycling down to the beach at Hartland Quay, windswept, craggy rocks, just a stunning lifestyle for a teenager, working in the local pub, getting to know everybody. And then when it came to going to university to study law, I went to Exeter because I didn't want to be far away from the countryside. And aside from a few stints living back in London and coming back to Exeter, I've been based in Exeter now for the last nearly 20 years. That's where I have my family and that's where I live, because I just don't want to be too far away from the sea or the moors or anywhere like that. And as a lawyer, I qualified into real estate because my rationale at the time was you could choose to have a city life or a rural life. If you understand property law, you could be dealing with agricultural land and rural property. Or if I wanted to be a city slicker, I could be dealing with real estate in the cities. And then I suppose, luckily for me, as the natural capital interest and sector and green finance and nature markets have started to gain momentum over these past 4 or 5 years or longer, having a background in real estate law was precisely what a company like Environment Bank needed from me, because the natural capital we're looking to create all relies heavily on land, complex legal relationships from a landowner community and from a land law point of view, and of course complex legal relationships with the people that need to buy that natural capital, because typically they're buying it to serve a need that is in a heavily regulated, very high risk situation, like the planning sector, like the development sector and biodiversity net gain. So I was lucky to be able to shimmy into the environmental world from what was a very traditional real estate background.
When you were thinking about career and you'd got it set in your mind, law was the way forward. Had you got any sort of was there a law running through the family? Did you know what that really entailed and how to get there?
No, oddly, my family were made up of mad people and criminals. I had a very unusual upbringing. I was in and out of foster care actually for quite a long time. So it was a real kind of rocky childhood, but one I think that I got a lot of, I suppose, inspiration from. I was determined to study hard, and in amongst the madness was creativity and a lot of love, albeit a lot of dysfunction as well. So I had never met a single lawyer in my life, apart from the lawyers that were dealing with a whole load of family childcare disputes, but and no professional sort of family members, and none that had been to university. Although my mum was a really creative woman, and she'd gone to university as a mature student studying theatre and theatre and education, but otherwise no professional background. I kind of idolised it, really. I loved this idea of Rumpole of the Bailey.
It was Ally McBeal for me.
Yeah, and Ally McBeal, definitely. And in an odd way, it's lived up to the dream for me. I've loved it. I love the intellectual challenge. I love trying to solve problems for people. And particularly in my role right now, I love the creativity. You know, we have got so much scope to shape how policies unfold. And with biodiversity net gain, in the role that I'm in now, we've got so much responsibility and an enjoyable sense of duty to help this policy succeed. And that's a deeply kind of rewarding position to be in, and one I would have never dreamed of in a million years.
When people say social mobility is not a thing and it's impossible, what do you say to that?
So it's such a good question, and I can't work out whether I was very lucky to have had, free school meals as a child, as an inner city primary school child. I had the aptitude to be able to get good grades as a self-starter, but that could well be because I was imbued with kind of an unusual level of self-confidence that not everybody has, and I just knew I wanted to push for this, and I just pushed and pushed. I kind of thank Tony Blair's education. It didn't seem like I was reaching for the stars to just want to go to university. I was really lucky that actually the amount I needed to push to get access to the opportunity to become a lawyer wasn't so hard, but it did take a lot of individual overconfidence even, which I may just be lucky to have been born with that constitution. Not everybody would have that confidence to push, and I really believe that the society we're in now does not make it very easy for people to push out of the kinds of poverty traps that people are being kept in. And I really do genuinely support any efforts to improve social mobility. And there's a lady called Sophie Pender who has a real brilliant profile on LinkedIn and others, who I deeply support the work that she's doing.
3%?
Yes, I think it's called the 93% Club, where the idea of making it a private members club for state educated people, and that's 93% of the people that have been educated. And I really love that movement, and I do identify with what she spoke about, which was that her experience in Bristol University, she felt ostracized and alienated because of her working class background. In my case, I remember feeling similar at Exeter University, but not quite so bad. And I just got a job down the boozer and spent most of my time with people I felt very comfortable with. So there are a lot of different ways to push through a lot of these cultural and financial barriers. And I feel deeply lucky that I got into the legal profession when I did. I was embraced for my individuality, which is rare. And really, you must not ignore the wider circumstances that bring your success forward, not just your own personal effort, because rarely is it always personal effort that gets you there. It's a little lift up along the way when you're lucky.
What was the balance percentage split, hard work and luck?
I worked really hard because I'm definitely a self-confessed geek. My friends will tell me, we would go out with our friends when it was A-levels time. I had a rucksack full of all of my study books because when there was a 15-minute gap between pints of beer, or in those days, I think, vodka and lilt, I would want to study. And I even set up a little study club in Heartland. And I used to, in exchange for getting given pudding by my friend's dad, I would bring a load of mates around the table and we'd all study. And the dad would walk in and he'd be like, bloody hell, what are these lot all doing studying? And I'd be like, in exchange for pudding, I can organise a study club. But I just loved it, and I don't know where that comes from or why that's there, but I have always enjoyed it, and oddly enjoyed being a bit of a ringleader with studying.
It's so my story is not elements of similarity, and although I realised after 1 year of law I wasn't clever enough, connected enough, or disciplined enough to be a lawyer, and I think if I'd have been a lawyer I'd probably be in prison right now, because I like the margin of things and finding the well, either I think
so as all good lawyers
yeah I think George said either I'd been very good lawyer or in prison, so either or. I was the first person to finish school, never mind uni, and I think yes, of course we all get a ton of luck. However, there's something about, and I sensed it as you were talking, your first pass at that, you didn't acknowledge the amount of hard work you put in over years and years to make it possible. People will meet you now and see this uber successful, incredibly impressive lawyer, and they think it's easy. I've never met anyone who found it easy. Whatever their social standing or setting when they started, if you were successful, it takes a fuck ton of hard work.
Yeah. Well, and I reckon my first shout out to my best lucky break, I would say, was when it came to applying for my training contract, which is really the route into this industry. And it's a difficult one and deeply competitive. And I had applied to Mitchell Moores, the law firm Mitchell Moores. And at the time, Tim Richards there was responsible for which trainees would be given a role. And hats off to them, because in the application form, one of the questions it asked was, what non-academic goals have you set in the last year and how did you achieve it? Now, in my head, I thought that's exactly where the gap year students would put their gap year stuff and the business that they set up in Thailand or the turtles they rescued somewhere else. And I put being able to cycle up Heartland Key Hill without needing to vomit when I get to the top. And they gave me the job, and I love the fact that they didn't throw that in the bin, and they knew that they were inviting a bit of an oddball into the firm, and I'll never be able to thank them enough for that, because that was the first and most important break for me.
Do you so I love that. I always read CVs bottom up, and a test of a CV, it's the equivalent of a date. Do you want to spend time with this person? Do you want to have a... That's the first gateway. Yes, I do. Brilliant. Right. Are they qualified? Have got everything else? Fantastic. But be different and stand out from the crowd. Do you associate with the term oddball?
Yes.
Okay. Do you not think everyone else is just not honest? And everyone's mad and they're just not sharing it?
Because now that's reminding me of another question in the application form, which was, how do you stand out from the crowd? And I was like, well, it depends on the crowd, because I might not stand out at all.
Great question. Yeah.
But I do think I'm probably a bit of an oddball. Most people say that I'm crazy at some point. And I take that to be some useful, valuable, regular and repeated feedback that I'm taking on board.
It's so we once ran an intern campaign that literally was a love letter to the Apple advert of calling the crazy ones the misfits and the rebels.
Yes.
And it was like, because there's no one in our team that's not crazy in some wonderfully creative ways. So opportune moment to shout out to a young soon to be lawyer who is friends of OC and loves the podcast and who helped me with the questions for you.
Wonderful.
She's currently in her first of 2 training years at Burgess Salmon and has had not a dissimilar background and overachieved to get where she is. So, hey, Emily, you're a star.
Well done, Emily.
So, when do you think the prospect of potentially moving from the real estate into environment law presented itself to you? Was it the role at the environment the first time you saw it?
Precisely that role. And for once, an organisation needed a general counsel with a real estate background. You know, it's such a limited group of companies that would need real estate.
What is is there a usual background that general counsels come
Normally,
from?
corporate commercial. They've got to know about, you know, company secretarial stuff, mergers and acquisitions, commercial contracts, governance and risk. And although I have a smattering of that sort of experience that is pepper potted in my sort of day-to-day professional life, that's really where a lot of companies need that general counsel to have a background in. So aside from pure real estate companies like residential developers or real estate investment companies, actually a real estate background has been fairly uninteresting to the corporate world. And I was really ready to move into a company where you could be outside of the sometimes claustrophobic partnership world. When you've been in firms that have been around for hundreds of years, doing what they do for hundreds of years, there's very limited scope for any kind of meaningful sense of impact or the ability to turn on a sixpence and face a new challenge that's presenting itself in society, in the market, or an opportunity. So I was really ready to be part of a, you know, fast-paced, high-octane, high-risk, but really rewarding corporate world. But as a real estate lawyer, it was difficult to find it. And then magically, you know, companies like Environment Bank pop up where suddenly your background is really valuable and where they need somebody that not only has a background in real estate, but is also a bit mad. And again, that combo isn't very often found. It's not often that the mad ones really want to know everything there is to know about the Law of Property Act 1925 or be in a legal world where the law hasn't changed much since 1925. So that wonderfully for me, those unique sort of paired requirements were what was needed for Environment Bank, where they needed somebody with enough creativity to duck, dive, wheel and wend and think and create policies, brand new documents, to work with government, to work with the Planning Advisory Service, you know, all of that stuff, but all of it with a deep underpinning of the Law of Property Act and equities darling and unregistered land and the land registry and stamp duty land tax and all those tedious
sexy things.
Exactly.
So what does an average day or week look like? Pick your time frame that works for you.
Okay, so we're heading into the event season, as I'd say, that we're kind of coming into that springtime where we've got lots of events coming up where there'll be a lot of panels I'm speaking at, various real estate events. I'm convening a round table specifically on biodiversity net gain section 106 agreements and conservation covenants, sort of using the event season to bring about as much kind of consensus as we can as the whole sector is getting to grips with biodiversity net gain and the policy. So at the moment, it's a mixture between head deep in a contract that we're negotiating with a national organisation that needs biodiversity units across the country, right the way to being on a panel and chairing a panel where we're talking about the challenges for SME developers accessing the biodiversity net gain market, right the way through to supporting and mentoring team members and coming to wonderful things like this. So it's a mixture of deep desk work and butterflying around the place. And that's a wonderful mix for me.
How does your energy work through a day? So my mornings, if I'm at home, in fact, I'm up 5 or 6, either in the gym or on the road to travel. And my brain's the best in the morning. If I'm going to write something creative, it's early, 6 to 8. And then I'll tail off throughout the day, and that's when coffee and other things become my friend. How does your energy work in a day? When are you at your best?
Well, it's an interesting one. I think I almost don't have any energy at all until
Sorry, to clarify, you don't have any energy.
so yeah.
Okay.
Then when 8 a.m. happens, it's like, and I have a standing desk. Like I barely even sit down. Like as I said to you, I'm not used to sitting down for
We
this
did
long.
ponder about like standing up throughout the entire podcast, but we felt that
might be a bit weird, but brilliant. But so I've got a standing desk, so everyone at work sort of jokes because I'm sort of chatting away and moving around and boogieing slightly at the desk, doing sort of silly lift jokes and things. And
Josh is in stitches behind the camera. He's laughing his head up.
so I think I do have quite a lot of energy, but it does take a lot of recuperation. Like I would sit in silence on a Sunday. And
Is that your down day? Sunday is your recharge?
It depends on how the weekend's panned out, because I might have been up raving all night on a Saturday. I would love to sit down and do a crossword over about 5 or 7 pints or something on a Sunday.
Okay. So is the Saturday raving a part of your rest and recovery mental regeneration?
Yeah, definitely. I feel absolutely revitalised after a rave.
Okay.
Definitely. Yeah. So, so yeah, a lot of energy. But also definitely the need for a quiet downtime. And my colleagues also joke that we might, for example, all meet up after work and have a few pints, but I'll disappear silently. When I'm ready to go, I go without saying goodbye, because I'm like, I'm ready now for my rest.
So we're never going raving together because I cannot comprehend beat, sound at all. Just does not work in my head. Head of operations Dave was a drummer. We went to uni together, and he would drum the beat of the song on my shoulder. I have no idea what you're doing, mate.
Does that mean you can't dance?
No, not at all.
Oh, you poor man.
I have no concept of like rhythmic movement.
Oh, you poor soul.
My skills pretty much are this and picking up heavy things and putting them down again. That's pretty much my wheelhouse. But that's my version of
small fish, cardboard box. You're nearly there.
Yeah. Helen, if you're watching this, I know that's my wife. You've tried. I know she's tried. She got a first dance at our wedding out of me, and that was it. I just cannot. Sadly, I've got a daughter, so I'm gonna have to do that again at her wedding probably. But outside of that, there'll be no more dancing. Please don't get married, Emma. Mad. So I think no one talks about the rest and recovery side of stuff. Everyone talks about working really hard, and it's something we really try to help people understand. And the fact that you've got those two very different types of rest and rejuvenation are really interesting. Have you always known that, or is that something you've had to learn throughout your career that you need that period?
I think it's probably come instinctively, and don't get me wrong as well, I would sit down and binge watch The Sopranos. That's another rest and recovery. Or currently Married at First Sight Australia is my guilty pleasure. So
okay, Ellie's off this camera just celebrating everything Alexa says. Without a shadow of a doubt, Elle's going to be like, I love her.
But I think I've felt it very naturally. So the weekend will come along and I'll just feel the restlessness and be like, right, I've got to go out boogieing.
Is the binge watching when your brain's tired?
Maybe. Maybe I've never quite categorised it.
Because I don't read if my brain's tired. Mm-hmm. So my brain just goes, I want more info, I want more ideas, feed me. Yeah. Like I can't go to sleep in silence. I fall asleep with the podcast in.
Me too. Have to have Audible on, innit? Yeah.
Yeah. And that's nothing. So I don't listen to anything new to fall asleep. I listen to 1980s and 90s vintage comedic wrestling podcasts. Yeah.
I listen to the same chapter of whatever audiobook I'm listening to time and again because
you know, yeah, exactly the same principle. Exactly the same principle. So needing that is a key part of it. But if my brain's shattered, I want to watch QI, Mock the Week, Have I Got News for You, and fall asleep on the sofa with my wife. Yeah. Whereas if my brain's not had enough, it's like, feed me more, feed me more. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, I totally identify with that massively. And I'll go through weird phases. Like in lockdown, I got really kind of esoteric in my need for new information. I ended up listening to an audiobook of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire.
I just bought one on the military tactics of the American Civil War.
I love that.
It just, and I have to do this at Christmas. So that warn the team, I will respect their Christmas holidays. We'll go away at Christmas. I read 6 books on elite performance cycling, watched the Tour de France series on Netflix. We came back to a cycling-themed Q0 event. That's not a joke. That literally happened, and I just did the whole thing around it. Because I'm like, right, I need something to give my brain to focus on, because some people say shutting off is the way to go. No, I don't feel relaxed that way. I would just get frustrated and annoyed. I need to be thinking on something. Yeah. Alexa, what's B&G?
So, biodiversity net gain. it is capturing improvements in biodiversity and packaging it up into biodiversity units and using this as a way for developers, when they develop land, to not only replace the biodiversity that they have lost through the development, but to add 10% more under current legislation. And biodiversity net gain attempts to apply a statutory metric to record the baseline biodiversity value of land and to help measure the gains for biodiversity that developers are required to bring so that they're leaving nature in a better state than they found it. And so it's imperfect. There are lots and lots of ways and reasons, rightly, to challenge how it works, but it's a start.
What is perfect?
Exactly.
We hold the environment sector to a standard that applies nowhere else.
Yeah.
So we don't say to a football team, no, you missed a shot, we're done, off you come, no more football. Yeah. Wrong shaped ball anyway, but off you come. It's just, I don't know why we have this obsession where it has to be absolute and perfect, and we let perfect be an enemy of better.
Indeed, and I do think it's not helped by there have been scandals, people are nervous about things actually accidentally causing harm when they thought it was going to do good. And there's so much to learn about, planting 10 trillion trees may not in itself do the benefits for nature that we're looking for. And we do have the challenges of distorted priorities. How does carbon sit with biodiversity? How does biodiversity and nature positivity sit with global warming and carbon emissions? And how does plastics fit in with all of this? How do we address these thorny challenges and problems in a way that balances it so that overall nature is and the environment is better and improved? And there's so much to learn, and I think it's good to keep challenging ourselves to improve. But you're right, we can't also find ourselves completely stultified and hemmed in by the fear of making a mistake. And actually, there's a really useful bit of guidance that has recently come out that I think should hopefully help companies to be more confident in their decision making. And this is a legal opinion published at the beginning of March, which is all about nature-related risks and directors' duties under the Companies Act. So directors have a general duty to act in the best interests of the company and the best interests of shareholders. And they have a general duty to not be incompetent. Now, what this legal opinion says is that directors of a company must take nature-related risks into account in their decision-making, and they must understand the nature-related risks that their company faces if they're going to successfully discharge their directors' duties under the Companies Act. And crucially, the headline of this legal opinion is a rational but wrong decision relating to nature is better than no decision at all in discharging your legal obligations. And that, to me, is music to my ears. We've got to make sure that we're not hemmed in and we're not paralyzed by the fear of making mistakes. We've got to behave rationally. We've got to understand the information that's around us. We've got to make good decisions that are steering us towards nature positivity.
I totally agree. We had an About Us video early on in OC that we might still have kicking around somewhere. One of my opening lines on it is, anyone who tells you they've got all the answers to this is just lying. Mm-hmm. And we played that to a room of institutional investors, all managing hundreds of millions of pounds. And they all burst out laughing at that point and went, why do we keep pretending we've got all the answers? Yeah. Because no one does. We're all trying to learn, and I'm sure we'll make mistakes along the way, and the next generation will fix some of those as well. But 70-80% of what we do will move us forward. And even if we're moving forward to learning another lesson, let's learn those faster and do what we can. If how much potential does BNG have to positively change the environment in the next 10 or 20 years?
I think it has a great deal of potential. What it represents to me is a very important first step towards policies that really do measure losses to nature and gains for nature, and that really do oblige organisations and sectors to leave nature in a better state than they found it. And it's a first step. It's a self-contained little microcosm because we can measure the baseline with relative confidence and accuracy. Of course, we are only measuring biodiversity in habitats. We're not measuring the actual thriving creatures within those habitats. We're having to use habitats as a proxy for biodiversity. There are challenges in that, but you've got to start somewhere. And you're able to measure the baseline, you're able to measure the gains, you're able to measure the losses that a developer causes, and you're able to replace those losses and then add more back on top. And it's a beautiful little microcosm of an example of where you can lead to a measured level of nature positivity. It's a world-leading example of policy making. It, of course, has challenges. The way it interplays with the planning system is a challenge because there are varying different ways that different local planning authorities want to approach this. This can make it difficult for developers who can't predict what they're going to need to do, can't predict what it's going to cost them to deliver what they need to deliver, and difficult for providers like us to assess demand. How can we make sure we're bringing forward habitat banks where they're needed if different planning authorities are taking different approaches as to how local it needs to be to the losses and similar? But setting aside those challenges, it is a massive step in the right direction, and other industries are watching carefully as before our eyes we are watching something move from a set of loosely applied policies under the National Planning Policy Framework into something mandatory. And there will be other sectors that need to watch out for this in other geographies and regions. We've got the interesting world of voluntary biodiversity net gain or biodiversity credits, however they're described. And, the sectors and companies are watching, preparing, looking to understand what bits of our industry are going to be next in the sightlines for the legislators. And that, to my mind, means that while BNG, biodiversity net gain, might be potentially quite small in its scope, it only relates to development. It only relates to development that is, happening on land where there is a baseline biodiversity value. So certain development may not have much of a biodiversity score at all on the baseline because there isn't much there. It will lead to mixed amounts of demand, but as time goes on, it may be as the policy beds in, legislation may move on to require 20% biodiversity net gain. They might require 30% biodiversity net gain so that the gains for nature relative to the losses start to go up and up. And then crucially, it will be what will be the next sector where there's enough scientific rigor to measure the losses and measure the gains to bring in something similar. And so it's a stepping stone, but I don't think it's going to solve all of our biodiversity depletion problems alone.
I agree. So our Director of Natural Capital, Chris, and I were having this discussion about the difference between the sort of private markets that are developing at pace in Scotland around nature credits in the absence of BNG and the regulated ones of the BNG framework. He thinks BNG will achieve more quicker and be more substantive. I think naturally I have an inclination for thinking the private market will go quicker because I'm largely cynical about the speed of the public sector doing anything, but it's got further than the private one has so far.
Exactly. And in a way, the mandatory regime is forcing developers into this. And our strong view is that this must work for the developers. It's got to work for nature, but if it doesn't work for the developers, we can't let this policy collapse because it doesn't work. It's got to be measurable, affordable. It's got to be predictable. It's got to be something that makes the development world embrace it as a way of being able to predict what their costs of development are going to be, to help them prioritize development in areas of low biodiversity value so that they're not destroying high biodiversity value habitats. And I think that it has to work. The voluntary market is a fascinating one because you've got a couple of drivers behind the voluntary market. You've got philanthropy, and just how philanthropic are these organisations ready to be when they're faced with geopolitical crises, war, supply chain challenges, all sorts of other challenges that a corporate is facing. How much will they prioritise that philanthropic giving for nature.
I think natural capital ends up being really terrible for the philanthropic sector, because why would you give your money away when you could invest in a project that has equal, if not better, impact scores, but could potentially offer you the ability to preserve that capital and go again with that impact? Exactly. So I think one of the sort of knock-on effects of that will be that impact. I also think it's really fascinating the pace factor in one thing in terms of developing, but also the language around marketing. So you talked about the voluntary market. We interviewed a brilliant marketing director, and his line was, the word voluntary has been the worst thing that happened to carbon markets. If they'd been called private carbon markets, people would have elevated them as something that is an investment, something you need to do. Yes. Whereas if it's voluntary, you're sort of almost dumbing down the quality quotient of it. Yes. So I keep trying to slip into private natural capital markets rather than voluntary ones. So
that's an interesting thing, yeah. And because I kind of thought voluntary kind of might work when a corporate wants to show its
that philanthropic bit
and generosity. Yeah. And in a way, setting aside that voluntary philanthropic kind of doing it for the good side, is the preparation for the future. It is future-proofing. It's how do we avoid the risk of stranded assets that we just won't be able to use anymore because the laws tighten up? How do we make sure we're preserving our shareholder value as we're coming into a future where investors are less interested in the polluting industries that don't have credible transition plans towards nature positivity? So there's a fascinating mix of the philanthropic here and now, what can we do that's right and good, as well as preparing for a future with unstable supply chains, nature shocks, events that will affect a company's ability to make the money it's used to making. And so there's a sort of preparatory future-proofing element to it. And that's the fascinating, it's a bit like the biodiversity net gain market as they built up to mandatory. You saw the likes of Barrett and others choosing to voluntarily deliver 10% gains on their schemes a good few years before they had to legally. So the exciting thing is that for as long as there is the collective expectation of tighter regulation, of more exacting requirements of investors, lenders being more concerned about the future-proofing of the companies they're lending to, then you'll start to see a swell of voluntary activity that is moving beyond philanthropic and largesse and more towards future-proofing and business resilience. Ultimately then, with a expectation of a mandatory world kicking in once we've got the science, the measurements, the matrices, the methodologies to have a reliable way of measuring a corporate's impacts and dependencies on nature.
I think we are there with all those things now. What we haven't got is the one that's gone first. So, or the critical mass of the first 2 or 3 big movers in a market. We had it in carbon, we had it with Microsoft and Google and Velux as a company going, do you know what, we are going to be lifetime net zero, bang, move. And all of a sudden those markets followed, because in the investment space, no one wants to be first, but absolutely no one wants to be last. So everyone wants the comfort of that crowd.
Yeah.
From a lawyer's perspective, what is required to form a BNG project, and what sits behind it to give people the confidence it's a thing?
So the magic, the holy trinity, the golden triangle is the landowner that really deeply understands and respects the nature outcomes that we're looking to deliver on a habitat bank. It takes a willing regulator to oversee this habitat bank, and it takes the willing developer to purchase these biodiversity units. And that holy trinity, golden triangle, is the mix of what's required. The biodiversity without the landowner's support is nothing. It won't last. The biodiversity and the landowner support and the developer without the local planning authority buy-in is nothing. And likewise, the biodiversity, the landowner and the planning authority being happy, but without the developer needing to buy the units, it's nothing. And we are here in the middle, where we are wanting to make it possible and easy and seamless for landowners to create high quality habitats And we help them deliver that safely into a heavily regulated high-risk market with and help to give that interface so that developers are transacting with a team that we have of ecologists, lawyers and planning experts, so that we are delivering these biodiversity units so that they can proceed with their development. And it's in that magical space, in this holy trinity, that we exist to bring what is in effect a streamlined and expert professional support for all of these participants in this.
One of the big sort of challenges I've heard of the approach of delivering BNG with a sort of sitting landowners is the emotional relationship of that landowner. That everyone paints a caricature of the farmer. They're always multi-generational, they've been there forever. So let's just roll with that stereotype for a start. I appreciate it's a complex picture of new entrants and long-term landholders and every different variety in between, but a theoretical farmer who's multi-generational farm, and it no longer will be farming, it'll be transitioning a part of that farm for nature. How have you seen that play out in terms of how that feels emotionally for a farmer who might be getting pressure from their neighbours about changing practices and things like that?
So that's a really good point, because we're actually very proud of the fact that our habitat banks are still agricultural. They are often still grazed, just by maybe slightly different breeds, not necessarily pure conservation breeds, but there are certain stock that is ideal for these habitat bank situations. We still have meadows and grassland. We still have land used for pasture. And so actually we view, and so do the landowners we work with, that this is actually just an ultra low intensity form of agriculture that is there to support the wider health of the wider landholding and to help fund the transition to more regenerative agricultural practices. So our habitat banks only work if they fit into our landowners' wider plans for their wider landholding. And crucially, we see this as very much agricultural. And it is something that is a kind of legacy that doesn't involve departing from agriculture, albeit it's a slightly different form. And there can be generational challenges. And some of our deals with landowners don't come through to full fruition because the generations don't necessarily see eye to eye. I call each habitat bank that we kind of launch a miracle, basically. And it's a miracle of the right land, the right landowner and their whole family being on board. But it's then magical once it's there. And so, yes, to us, we don't think it's taking it out of agriculture. If anything, it's more in line with the agriculture of 1947, when the Inheritance Tax Act defined agriculture. It's that sort of agriculture before we went ultra intense.
I suppose that's a really useful counter to the narrative that we see a lot at the moment, no farmers, no food type challenge about the... We've done a lot of work and published on the fact that the challenge around food security, I think, is massively overplayed. When you have a situation whereby 8% of the country is in golf courses, 4% is in grouse moors, and 30% of the food, according to DEFRA, produced on farms in the UK didn't leave a farm in 2021 because there was no one to pick it, and the aesthetic standards for the supermarkets wasn't good enough. And the food that did leave, 30% was wasted in the home. So when you sit those against the fact that we've also got an obesity epidemic, how can we have a food security issue?
Exactly. And then there was the Dimbleby food reports, land use reports thing that came out a couple of years ago, where he'd identified sort of 3 core land use types, where you had intensive agriculture. There's always got to be that somewhere in that picture. Then he described it as land sparing and land sharing. So land sparing is where it's truly taken out of agriculture, but there's land sharing, and that's where we think our habitat banks exist. There may be low intensity agriculture continuing, and they're still taking a hay cut or similar, bringing up beef stock and orchards and similar. And overall, it's restoring the soil health, it's bringing the pollinators, it's potentially improving the productivity of that land. So I agree, we think there's got to be room for all of these, and it's been heavily balanced in favour of high intensity agricultural practice, and we can just find a way to draw a better balance.
People don't like acknowledging we live with complexity and contradictions. They want simplicity and 10-second sound bites, and the environment's too complicated for that.
Yeah, agreed.
The contract that sits and underpins a B&G agreement, length of time we're talking about for that?
33 years is what we go for. So we buy ourselves a buffer zone of 3 years to get the habitat creation works done, the enhancement works done. Sometimes we need to do a bit of nutrient stripping. So there might be just some no inputs cropping to just get some of that excess nutrients out of the soil. That can take a couple of years. And so it is a long time. It's a long time for landowners to feel comfortable with. But then, of course, from an environmental point of view, people say that's just the blink of an eye. That's hardly any time at all. And that's another fascinating challenge in all of this. How long is long enough? Now, we're speaking with various people that were in various different rooms when the legislation was being debated about the statutory minimum period of time for biodiversity net gain, which is 30 years. I was speaking with Jeremy Moody, a sort of celebrity in the agricultural world, and he said very vividly, in the room with the people that were deciding on this, they had to make sure that this was accessible. If we had to make it be a permanent land take, how much could that constrain the supply of land for this? We've got to make sure this is workable and affordable and doesn't end up dying simply because it kills the viability of schemes and it never happens. And of course, could generate huge backlash to the point that politically the will to legislate for pro-environmental forces is just lost. He said there were debates around, should it be 80 years? Should it be 30 years? Should it be in perpetuity? They alighted on 30 years as being a period of time that is just much better to get some gains for nature over 30 years than not. Similarly, once that 30-year period is over, DEFRA has indicated they would be looking to allow people to top up onto new biodiversity net gain schemes, that there may be other incentives to keep going with the nature positive activities. And of course, it's still agricultural use. It's just low intensity, better for the environment. Perhaps it can just continue to be used in that way. And in the next 30 years, hopefully, the wider transition towards nature-friendly farming will mean that it doesn't seem like it's standing out like a sore thumb as well. So that's the length of the agreement, and our habitat management plans are naturally adaptive, of course, because you've got to react to the situation on the ground. If certain habitats aren't taking, they're failing, they're getting overgrazed, then we work with the landowners to adapt the management plan so that we're always making sure it's dynamic and it works. It's not set in stone and just, banging your head against a brick wall.
Mm-hmm. We were travelling earlier this week. We pulled up at a service station, and Rugby service station. You walk out, the entire back of the car park from left to right is just electric car chargers the whole way. And I think the way we think about that now, so if you went back 33 years and you walked out of a set and saw that, it would be so alien. Yeah. It would be such a jarring. But actually, because it's been a progress over 15 or so years, it's just normal now, perfectly normal. We're going to see the same thing on the return of the landscape, whereas shifting baseline syndrome has seen species abundance and variety just be lost by the year. Hopefully we're going to gain it back by the year, so that when people do look at a landscape in a few years' time, actually, ironically, it'll be returned back to it a little bit better than it was post.
Exactly. And interestingly as well, listening to sort of experts and university experts, in Oxford University is a real powerhouse of research into policy and nature positivity. And they make a really good point there that our baselines are so shit anyway. Let's just not, again, get too upset if it's only 20 years. I'm
going to tell you a terrible baseline story. we went to view a site on the Isle of Wight that we were offered for acquisition. And the land agent was a lovely chap. And he said, I've done a great deal for the farmer here. I've got them 40 grand a year in countryside stewardship. Brilliant scheme. We've absolutely transformed the place. It's going to smash it from a B&G perspective. I said, that's interesting. What baseline did you take? Oh, we haven't done that yet.
Yeah.
And I had to explain to him, and you should have seen the colour drain from his face. And he was like, how am I going to tell the landowner? I'm like, that's going to be a toughie. That is going to be a toughie. And it shows he was genuinely trying to do, A, what he thought was economically right for his client, but B, he genuinely thought he was improving the environment there and taking a step forward. He hadn't realised the loss in B&G he was going to deliver.
Poor man. And also, I've got a similar baseline story the other way where, before developers had really cottoned on to what was going on here, what would happen is land that's earmarked for development might just come out of the agricultural rhythm of that land holding, and several years go by and the next thing you know, you've got some beautiful meadow, and you were always going to develop it. And I feel very sorry for those outcomes, because it does have the risk of giving this policy a bad name when it's just the accident of ignorance that means that suddenly this baseline has been risen because of development, but all the wrong way round. So baseline's a really important part of all of this, and really understanding that baseline is central to this policy working.
And it's why also, if you've got, so we don't manage land for other people, we only manage our own internal land. So it's why, if you are a farmer and a landowner who wants to embark on this, get some advice and support on it from people who understand how the system works, present company included, as opposed to trying to do it solo. I think there's places for DIY, but plumbing and electrics aren't those, nor are new forms of natural capital products and services.
Exactly. And I mean, there's so many ways to do it, and there's a lot of noise in the market. And what we're seeing is a very broad picture of what the landowners across the country are saying to us, what the planning authorities across the country are saying to us, and what the developers are saying to us, which is often a very ignored voice in all of this. And it's a real kind of challenge, because landowners, the developers we're speaking to are really feeling quite upset, because they feel, the phrase they will use is price gouging is going on. People are getting maybe overexcited about where this magical money is going to come from to fund all of these gains. In the end, it's coming from somewhere. It's coming from the developers. It's coming from the people who are buying these dwellings, or the occupiers of these, the tenants of these buildings. So we can't get too overexcited about the expectations. And I know landowners have got wildly different expectations of what they could expect for their natural capital on the land. And, in the end, it's only going to work if we can settle on a sort of macroeconomic basis on something that genuinely works for everybody.
Yeah. We've seen some amazing perspectives on natural capital. One of my favourite, and I just revisited a piece I wrote on this about a lovely person we met in Cheshire when we went to view a farm. The landowner was truly horrific. It's the only person that's been that unpleasant that Josh commented on the person, and he was just horrible. And he went, so this natural capital thing, talk me through it. So talked to me about it and said this, and he's like, I don't think it's a thing, so it isn't. It's like, okay.
I think, therefore I am.
Yeah, brilliant. He did have a picture of that means my land should be worth twice as much, right? And I was like, I'm not sure how you getting to that point, right? Well, it's not a thing then. Great, fantastic. Yeah, he did. Yeah. Solar doesn't work in winter or autumn or ever, but it's really productive here. Interesting show. Oh, and favourite one, technology hasn't moved on at all since the 1940s, and it was like, okay, you meet some wonderful characters in our line of work. How do you ensure the change that's delivered on the ground is actually meaningful and beneficial?
Yes. So a lot of that has got to be around actually excellent design in the first place. So our ecologists are absolute BNG pros. The effort that goes into these scheme designs is immense and beautiful.
And that's a core of your team, right? The ecology side.
Absolutely. And our ecologists design amazing schemes with climate change utterly in mind. And we have so much contingency built into these schemes, including contingency funding, so that when things go wrong, there's money to put it right. And so the design of the scheme is essential. Understanding the soil conditions, the hydrology, the due diligence that goes into a habitat bank is huge, expensive, and at our risk. So those are the essential kind of building blocks to design a scheme that has the right chance of success. Also, what I like about what the mandatory biodiversity net gain regime is looking to achieve is divorcing the point at which you're planting and sowing these habitats from when a developer starts their development, because actually that's artificial when it comes to nature. the right thing to do is plant when the planting needs to happen
Yeah.
from a nature cyclical point of view, not when a supermarket wants to occupy a store or whatever else the local planning authority may be trying to hook it to. So trying to divorce with a clean break, which is a key principle of ours, the developer buys the biodiversity units, it is divorced from their occupation. The management plan needs to happen when the nature needs it, not when someone wants to occupy a store or start a development. So that's a really core principle of ours. There must be a clean break. Those building blocks, making sure you truly understand the hydrology, you understand the soil conditions, that the target habitat types are totally appropriate for this place. That all helps to ensure the long-term success. Then, of course, making sure those capital works, the creation and enhancement works are done really well, properly monitored and overseen. Then you're looking for failure, looking for overgrazing, making sure you're replacing those things. And then this is when the unknown starts, the ongoing management and monitoring. Now, our model makes sure that we marry the management payments with knowing that the work has been done. So there's no taking the cash and running off into the sunset, and then in a couple of years you've run out of energy and time and money, can't really be bothered. This money is released year on year next to seeing that the actions have been taken. Now, we don't expect our land managers to be responsible for the success of what's delivered, because that's our design responsibility. But we do expect the work to be done to a good standard. And by making sure that the money goes hand in glove in lockstep with the actions for those 30 years is part of what preserves that success and preserves that interest and makes sure these things don't get abandoned and forgotten. So that's a crucial part of our model, is that it's not, the money doesn't all land on day one, leaving it to a very kind of mysterious and unknowable future. And that management and monitoring is crucial. And that's why we're really looking forward to seeing how local planning authorities take on that responsibility in the long term. And crucially, what responsible bodies are going to come out of the woodwork and start to be a crucial part of the Holy Trinity, the Golden Triangle.
Nice. In terms of the sale of credits when they're there, how do you think about potential buyers and what criteria they have to meet before you work with them?
One thing that's really helpful, I think, in the mandatory BNG market is actually we don't have the same greenwash risk that you do have in the voluntary or private market, as
Nice.
we call it.
Good throwback.
So, because we have a neat set of rules. Okay, they might be imperfect, they might be causing a bit of confusion in the market, lawyers might be confused, planning officers might be confused, but you do have regulations that say the developer needs to buy biodiversity units, they need to be governed under a 106 or conservation covenant, and it needs to be embodied in a biodiversity gain plan. So isn't the same kind of due diligence, the sort of, does this corporate deserve the halo effect of what's happening here? Instead, it is, does this product stand up to the right scrutiny that legislation requires? Is it being delivered to the standard required? And is it being delivered in a way it will succeed? And does this developer need planning permission? And that's quite straightforward. The difficult bit is the route of that through a sometimes arbitrary planning system, making sure we address all of the planning ecologists' questions and then some, making sure we're reassuring that planning officer that these gains for nature are right for that development. And that process is policed heavily. And our job is there in the weeds with those developers, helping them to overcome those hurdles that the planning authorities apply.
Is there a buyer that if you were asked for legal opinion on that, you would say, I think that's a risk reputationally for us as a business, is someone that would tarnish your product? Not a company necessarily, an industry or a sector. Yeah,
it's a difficult one because the companies that need this the most are the worst ones. You know, if at my personal view, and I think this works, is corporates need to be on a credible, and I mean credible, transition journey with a credible transition plan. If the natural capital we're delivering to that corporate fits into a credible transition plan, then we're proud to deliver it. And as long as it's not getting wound up in any kind of overstating, and that's where it's got to slot into a credible transition plan, the nature of the corporate itself, there are challenges around that. And we have a sort of vetting process that just makes sure that we're confident as a team, including our landowners, that corporate is not going to bring about some guilt by association risk. It's almost similar to how charities need to be careful about who they take donations from. That process is almost similar. But crucially, it's got to be part of a credible transition plan and not greenwashy and not kind of being in.
What about a coal power station? A new coal power station?
That's a challenge. Because if they wouldn't really be able to clean up their act in a credible transition plan. So I think they fall at the transition plan hurdle, unless we're confident that there is a genuine transition plan, but it's a new one, so it's unlikely.
Yeah. So while I was asking the question, I was thinking I'm being an absolute hypocrite about the standard. Not in the sense that we would sell a carbon credit or something to that industry, because we wouldn't, but am I holding the environment sector to a standard I wouldn't hold another? So can the CEO of an oil company go buy a Patagonia jacket and wear it on site? Yes, they can.
Yeah.
Can they all buy any form of... Can they buy milk from the organic dairy at the Carpet Foot Dairy at the end of their road? Yes, they can.
Yeah.
So you can either be a free marketeer or not, I suppose.
And it's almost how is it being used? Is it being used cynically? Is it underhand? Is it sleazy? And if it's part of a credible transition plan and the due diligence is made on that transition plan, then I think we solve a lot of those moral challenges.
Yeah.
Because, everybody deserves a chance to try and clean up their act. And I feel like I want to be part of what supports these corporates to get where they need to go, alongside all the other pressure that they are rightly coming under: strategic litigation, client earth, shareholder activism, their own corporate fears of stranded assets, their own obligations to report under, as Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures and other frameworks start to build momentum. So I do believe, as long as what is being invested in from a natural capital point of view is part of a credible transition plan, I'm all for it. And that kicks the problem down the road to what is a credible transition plan. And I'm quite happy doing that.
Can't solve it all this afternoon. I mean, it's Friday. What does... so we're recording this at the end of April 24. If we sit back down in a year's time, which I very much hope we do, what will you have been proud to achieve in business and life?
I would like to think that we have more thousands of acres of land under management for biodiversity net gain. I'd like to see our existing schemes thriving. I'd like to have seen that some haven't thrived, but we've spotted it and we've corrected it and we've been open about that. I'd like to see developers embracing this policy because they are a crucial part of that triangle. And I'd like to see better engagement with the people like developers that are truly affected by this legislation and by these changes, so that we get buy-in from the people that we need the buy-in from the most. And I'd love to see even more landowners embracing these new ways of managing land, and feeling less scared about making decisions to go into this with better policy clarity and a general sense of settlement of this new regime. And I'd love to see other jurisdictions taking inspiration from what's happened here and to be part of helping to identify and learn from the mistakes. And I'd love to know that the Section 106 roundtable on the 1st of May will have brought about such a flourishing consensus in the industry that that precedent that emerges from that will be used wide and far all year round.
What an amazing end. Thank you so much for coming in. It's been an absolute joy to have you as part of the shoot room.
Really honoured to be here.
Perfect. Thanks. Bye, guys.